I'm returning from another vision quest, which is a traditional Native American practice that Native people have done for centuries that involves going out to fast alone in the mountains for 4 days and nights with no food, no water. I've gone dozens of times, and now it's about just over 2 weeks at the time I'm filming this video since I came down. And there was a chapter that I published in a book, which I tell people don't bother to buy the book, just read the newer articles on my blog. You can read those articles for free, and my writing has improved dramatically over all these years. One of the chapters I wrote way back, I think it was 2009, was called Riding the Storm Out. But let me back up just a minute. From an early age, earliest memories, I was drawn to Native Americans. I mean, in those days, our parents left the television set on, as that was our babysitter in many instances. And when I would see the Native people getting killed or wiped out, I'd be screaming and throwing fits. Conversely, when the Native folks are getting the upper hand and wiping out the cavalry, I'd be like, yeah, get them. And that fascination grew into adolescence. And by the time I was 17, I'd made my way to Oklahoma, living in a community of Kiowa Indians, and began to attend the peyote meetings with the Native elders. And it was in the peyote meetings that I met my mentor, Horace Dalkai, one of the last surviving traditional doctors among the Kiowa tribe. By the way, I think I forgot to mention I'm Ben Ufana, which you can see on the screen there. But anyway, so I wanted so much to learn from one of the traditional Native American doctors when I began to hear about the profound visionary experiences they would have and the gifts of healing and the other kinds of paranormal or supernatural powers or that these individuals possess. At the age of 14, I'm thinking to myself, well, if I'm ever given the opportunity, this is what I'm going to do with my life. And so I started saving money. Again, 17, I've taken off, and then I'm living in this community of Kiowa Indians in southwestern Oklahoma, sitting up all night in the peyote meetings with the Native elders, sitting in some of the meetings with Horace, my mentor, and watching him work. I was transfixed. I could feel that immense power that was working through him as he would work with his patients, and wanting so much to learn and to go in this direction. And I was terrified that he would say, well, you're white, this only works for Native people, and I can't teach you these things. Good luck. Yeah. But when I approached him and said very awkwardly, I want to learn to do what you're doing, and is physically shaking, and he says, what are you doing this weekend? Can you start fasting? And still shaking, I said, yeah, sure. And he had me drive down into the Wichita Mountains, sitting in my car that weekend, not eating or drinking. I can't say that much of anything happened other than that was his way of testing me to determine if I was truly serious. I met him a few days later at a peyote meeting that he had conducted. And we spoke for a while, and he said, well, when you finish your semester in college, come on out to New Mexico we'll get started. He was living on the Navajo Indian reservation with his wife and his 3 youngest children. And the apprenticeship was very intensive. And a lot of these traditional Native doctors, if you go back decades, and my mentor was one of the last ones that I know of to possess this capacity, but he would transmit portions of his own healing gifts to me. a big part of the training in order to earn the right to work with these gifts of healing, what they refer to as medicine, involves going out to fast alone in the mountains for 4 days and nights without food and water. I started out with Horus, going through the vision quest, and then as time went on, I was on my own. I missed a number of years in my 20s, but around the time I turned 30, I was feeling this immense pull that I needed to return to the Wichita Mountains. So I reached out to a few friends, and one of them agreed to help to facilitate the process. Mainly gave me a place to stay before and after, and driving me down and picking me up and everything. And that first time I was woefully unprepared. I had a sleeping bag that was not in any way adequate, and I froze my ass off. And I'm so thankful that it did not rain because I wouldn't have been able to complete that vision quest, but fortunately it didn't. So I made my way down, and it's a very profoundly powerful experience. Even that first time that I went on the vision quest, there are times, especially the fourth night, where you feel this extraordinarily powerful presence, these other forces or beings literally descending into my body. And as that happens, in many ways, it's like a near death experience. I would have portions of my life or even specific events, I would be reliving them. All that would be coming back very powerfully, incredibly vivid. All the rich sensory experiences, all the emotions attached to those events. I was reliving these early traumatic experiences, and I could feel these forces or beings working within me, enabling me to process or digest these traumas, all the emotions attached to them, digesting them like the food that I eat. As that happened, there's this healing or transformation taking place, and I come out the other side feeling much lighter. So I started going back to the Wichita Mountains in spring and the fall, going twice a year. And you can do the math. It's been, let's see, started going in 1993, like clockwork, spring and fall, year after year. I just keep going. And it's intense to get through. I mean, fasting without food, it's not that big of a deal. It's pretty easy. But when you subtract water, you're not drinking water at all. That's extraordinarily difficult, especially when you're out in the wild and you're out in the open with the elements. And over all these times, I check the weather forecast. I start weeks in advance, actually, and I've learned to prepare myself because of all of these experiences I've had, and because going into it, there's all kinds of things that could happen. There's often the wind blows like hell. And especially when you're up on the mountain, the wind is so much stronger. And the Midwest, states like Oklahoma, you don't have all the trees. And most of the Midwest, you don't have mountains, except you have the Wichita Mountains in southwestern Oklahoma and another range in the east and in Arkansas too. But it's like a wind tunnel in many ways. And then in recent years, more drought conditions, but still occasionally they'll have storm fronts blow through, and there will be like massive downpours sometimes, or maybe it can rain for 2 or 3 days and little breaks in between or something. One time I went shortly before publishing that book. As I said, don't buy the book, just read the free articles on my blog. I'm a much better writer now than I was then. I checked the forecast, and the first 2 days were kind of nice. It was up to 60 degrees and very comfortable. But I knew that a storm front was coming through But when I turned on the phone, I think it was on the third night, what I saw was quite alarming. At that time, I had a flip phone and the reception wasn't very good. But as I was scrolling through the Weather Channel's app, it was like hour after hour. And so from the forecast, it appeared that it was going to be 36 hours of snowstorm. And my first thought was, oh shit. And then I have to prepare myself for this. And so, yes, it was raining very heavily at first, and there was thunder in the distance, lightning was striking even nearby. And I was initially thinking, like, well, I hope I don't get struck by lightning, but the it transition, as I said, to sleet and then snow, and the wind was blowing so hard that the snow was blowing sideways. I had my sleeping bag and what they call a bivy sack. And for those who don't know, a bivy sack is this, um, I think it's made out of nylon usually, and they're supposed to be waterproof. Mine had already used it for some time. It had these abrasions on it. So as all the snow was falling, uh, accumulating, I think it was something like 6 to 8 inches. And as the snow was melting and seeping through my sleeping bag was getting wet, and consequently I'm getting wet too. And the snow continued to fall for hours. And I was afraid to get out of the bag and move around, walk around. It's very difficult to be in the sleeping bag because cocooned like that. And I would be laying on my back and then turning on my left side, then turning to my right, sometimes turning face down, all the while my body aching. And that went on for hour after hour. Into the fourth day, I think it was maybe around 3 in the afternoon, the snow finally let up. And once it did, I did get out of the sleeping bag. I wouldn't do so beforehand because I was thinking if I ended up covered with snow and then got back in the sleeping bag, then that snow would melt and I would be even more wet than I was before. And the fact that my clothes had gotten wet somewhat, and once I got out, I was pacing, I was walking back and forth. My body was aching. I needed that exercise. And because it was so cold, the clothes on my body were like freezing, literally frozen. My sweatpants, for instance, they were crunchy because they had uh, frozen on my body as I was outside for hours. Native Americans, again, it was this is a practice that they in a number of the tribes had done for centuries. I'm not sure how far back it goes, but for a very long time. The thinking or the understanding is that whatever you encounter, you just deal with it. You don't make excuses, you don't cancel, you don't flake out, you deal with it. They would make exceptions if, say, someone got bitten by a rattlesnake and or there was some other life-threatening crises. It's like, okay, well, then you come down, but otherwise you stay and deal with it. And why? It's uh, native elders. I reflected as I was going through that ordeal. I would say that you want something really good. You want to receive that medicine, that those healing gifts or powers, those other kinds of extraordinary gifts and powers that many of these individuals possessed over the centuries. I've heard many accounts from the traditional native elders. If you want that, you got to make a sacrifice. They say you really suffer for it, or you're going to go through some things. And so I was determined to endure. Now, I was concerned that the friends who had dropped me off at the base of the mountain would be worried. So at one point, I opened up my phone and I tried to make a call, say, hey, I'm okay. And but I couldn't get through. I found out afterwards that one of my friends had made numerous attempts to call me and she was getting kind of frantic. Anyway, I endured. And then that cold wind continued to blow fiercely from the north. So the sky cleared off in the late afternoon. And what happens when that cloud cover goes? That means the temperature drops. The cloud cover helps to regulate the temperature, it keeps it within a certain range. But once it blows off, especially with the north wind blowing so strongly, the temperature dropped to, I think, in the mid 20s or so. And again, because of the weather forecast, I was grossly unprepared. I didn't have an adequate jacket. I'm freezing my ass off in the sleeping bag, and my toes are starting to go numb. And so I literally took pairs of underwear and additional pairs of socks, and I stretched them over my feet, and I took bandanas and I tied them around my feet, and even Walmart shopping bags and anything I could put on there to add extra layers to keep from getting frozen toes. But I was still freezing my ass off. I spent much of the night curled up in fetal position trying to conserve energy and not freeze. But I got through the night, and as it's getting close to sunrise, I start making my preparations. I'm packing up as quickly as I can, and my friends were scheduled to pick me up around 8 a.m. And so I start making my way down the mountain. The Wichita Mountains, especially where I go, is covered with small juniper trees, but also the incline is rather steep, and there are these huge slabs of limestone, and it's easy to fall and break bones if you're not careful. There are yucca plants, and those things can poke you. They would hurt quite a bit. And even worse, there's prickly pear cacti, and they have thorns that are over 2 inches long. And those thorns are extraordinarily sharp, and they'll go right through leather boots. In addition, they have all these zillion little tiny thorns, which I've gotten lots of them embedded in my body. And sometimes it takes more than a month to get them out. So I was thinking, like, going down, I got to be careful so I don't seriously injure myself. And yet the mountain's covered with snow. How am I going to do this? But I'm gradually making my way down. But with the snow, I was sliding down the mountain in places, and I couldn't help but laugh. I found it pretty amusing. But finally, making my way down to the base, and I had stashed a bottle of water, and I didn't have much time to drink. I had arranged to meet the friends, Nancy and Joe, who had agreed to pick me up. And I was so relieved to see their truck coming down the road, those headlights off in the distance. Once I made it to the truck and I got in, and they were shaking their head in disbelief, like, you made it through that snowstorm, those third and fourth day night. You got through all that. And since that time, I've gone through a few dozen more vision quests. And every one of them is a challenge in one way or another. Again, being out in the open, exposed to the elements. And in more recent years with global warming, I know a lot of people deny it, but year by year, they're recording record breaking temperatures in all these various parts of the world. And in Oklahoma, what's happening is that the hot weather is extending further into the year. So we're getting into like uh, third and even up to the fourth week of October, and you'll still have temperatures up in the 90s. A year ago, when I went in October, it was 88 the day I went up there, and it was like 91 and up to 93. Unfortunately, cloud cover came in on the fourth day and saved my ass. This year, I was intending to go right about the same time. And had I done so, it would have been up to 93 degrees again, which is really hellish when you're not drinking water. you're dehydrated. And then it's insanely hot. It feels much hotter without the water. I remember a year ago in October, and I would strip down to my underwear, and I was laying behind those small juniper trees, and they don't provide the greatest shade. A lot of sun is still coming through, and I got really cooked, quite sunburned. And I was using the turban cloth at the Sikhs, those huge turbans that some of the men wear. I used that cloth and I had it wrapped all around my face because it's about the finest, most sheer cloth you can get that still shields you. But despite that, I was still getting sunburn all around my eyes and the bridge of my nose. I got sunburned so many times up there. So I delayed my journey to the mountain by a week. Once I got there, first 2 days, wonderful. They were in the 70s. Mix of sun and clouds. It's some of the best weather you could have for being on the mountain. But there's a big storm front coming in. As I was driving down to the mountain, one of my friends called and he's saying, maybe you ought to reconsider going to the mountain this time. It looks really bad. And I thought about it and I looked at the weather app and yes, it looked horrible. But as I was talking with them, I'm like, well, if it gets too bad, I'll make my way down. Because those thunderstorms, they can be really intense, violent at times. I've had times I've been on the mountain when that lightning flashes and illuminates the sky, looking off in the distance, I see the funnel clouds forming. Funnel clouds is in tornadoes. And a lot of times the funnel clouds form, but they don't actually touch down to the ground. If they do, then the consequences are more devastating. But that time they didn't. Oklahoma is known for having these tornadoes. I forget how many years ago. Moore, Oklahoma, a suburb of Oklahoma City, and it ripped this huge swath out of the town, homes and businesses. It flattens everything. They do happen at times. Anyway, as I said, I was talking with my friend. I said, yeah, if it gets really bad, I'll come down. Having gone through the Vision Quest so many times and having endured so much inclement weather, I've learned how to prepare. And so I took a rain tarp, the tent, and a bivy sack. Unfortunately, I was still using that same one. And once I got on top of the mountain, I immediately began to set up the tent. I tied the rain tarp as secure as I could between two juniper trees. And of course, the tent is positioned between those juniper trees to create the most secure shelter that I possibly could. Again, we're anticipating some really violent storms coming through, a whole series of them. The storm actually made its appearance in the early hours of the morning. I think that was the third. The force of the storm, the wind, I mean, the tent was, I thought it was going to tear it up. I thought it was going to completely destroy the tent. But it held. And I think being positioned between the two juniper trees and having the rain tarp above created some degree of protection. Now, what was nice is, if you could see it that way, is these storms would rage for an hour or two, and then it would start to abate. It would come in with this ferocious intensity, and then it would settle down. That those few days there, we had over 7 inches of rain. So that's quite a lot. There was flooding in Oklahoma. There were flood watches as well as tornado watches. It was a mess. But it would subside and then it'd stop, and even the sun would come out at times. So whenever the rain would abate, or sometimes even before, I would throw on a rain poncho. I didn't want to be stuck in a tent. And if it's dry or if it's only just scattered showers, I don't take a tent. Maybe I'll use a rain tarp, but most of the time I'm sleeping outside. But in this case, when those storms abated, I would get out, walk, pace back and forth. My body needs exercise, and I much prefer to be outside. But then the next storm would come in, and yeah, back in the tent, sheltering again. And each storm was, yeah, intense, pretty violent. The worst of the storms hit on the fourth night, shortly before sunrise. And that tent, since about 3.5 feet high, but the force of the wind, the storm, pushed the top of the tent down from 3.5 feet high. I was laying on my back right at that time, and it was literally about 6 to 8 inches above my face. Again, I thought it was going to destroy the tent, but no, amazingly, it held up, but it did rip the rain tarp off. It was still attached in places, but once that storm began to subside and it lightened up, I turned on the weather app again. When I looked the day before, it looked like there's going to be a window of time where I could make my way down the mountain after the fourth night. But when I looked this time, I think it was like 6 in the morning, and no, it looks like it's going to continue to rain till it said 11. It actually went past 12 noon. And it's like, I've already been up here 4 days and nights. No, I'm not going to keep sitting up here. I'm not going to wait another 6 or however many hours. It had let up some on the rain, but I started packing as quickly as I could. And the rain started picking up again. And then the lightning was striking. It's like, whatever. Just, and I was continuing to pack as quickly as I could. And once I got everything packed up, I said the initial thank yous or prayers, whatever, to the spirits of the mountain, those forces, those beings. And then I started heading west across the top of the mountain. And there's all this like really dense juniper trees. They're close together and it's hard to cut through there, but doing what I can and make it through. Then I start making my way down. Again, I'm having to be very mindful of the fact that it's raining and there's assume that the surface of those slabs of limestone are going to be slick. I could fall and break bones. Yucca plants can stab you, those prickly pear cacti with those long ass over 2 inches thorns and all those zillion little micro thorns. And then there's a lot of what you call scrub oak. It's this small brush. I think it's related to oak trees, but it's a few feet high. But it's very gnarly. It grows very dense, and having to work my way around these patches to make my way down. And it's raining like crazy, and let up some and start raining again and heavier. But I finally get down, and there's all this water streaming down the mountain. And getting down, there's water standing everywhere. It's flooding. You'd have places where 6 or 8 inches or more water, or a foot or more, standing in places. And finally made my way to the water and Recharge, which is a sports drink made from fruit juice. It has lots of electrolytes, and I'm drinking. And then the heavy bags, I pull them back onto my shoulders. Everything is so heavy because it's soaked. Once I got to the car, I had a barn that I could park the SUV in. So I opened the doors and I'm changing into dry clothes and make a few calls and head down to the Airbnb that I'd reserved. When I go to the mountain, when I'm up there during the Vision Quest, especially, you go through these ordeals, snowstorm or massive thunderstorms and lightning striking and raining for hours on end. At times I've gotten quite wet up there. I'd be soaked. Early on, when I just had a tarp and not a very good one, I'd be wet for days. And going through that so many times. First, I went with my mentor, or he had me go, and then started going back again on my own in the fall of 1993, and then going over and over in spring and fall and just keep going. And you go through this ordeal so many times. And while I'm up there, I go into these profoundly deep altered states, especially when conditions get really bad. I go into survival mode. People ask me, why in the world do you even go through this to begin with? Why would you put yourself through such an ordeal? Why do you keep going? Why do you keep going through this? And it's for a number of reasons. Having trained with this traditional Native American doctor, medicine man, this is a practice Native Americans have done for centuries. And there was a time in my 20s, and I was struggling with a lot of the trauma and other deeply wounding experiences that had carried over from my childhood and adolescence that I'd internalized. And some of my relationships at the time were very painful reenactments. And I got to work with some extraordinarily gifted healers, but those opportunities were very few and far between. And I was suffering badly. But when I first began to feel that pull to return to the Wichita Mountains, I was reflecting on my training with my mentor Horace and conversations with all these Native elders and how they described as so many instances of these individuals who go through the vision quest and these forces or beings would come to them and they'd receive these extraordinarily powerful gifts as what they refer to as medicine, these powers, and they could facilitate these truly miraculous healings. I'd see my mentor, working with people with cancer and other life-threatening conditions, people who weren't expected to live, and he would work with them and they would heal and go on to live meaningful and productive lives. And things like even how he, on one occasion, closing an open wound, just truly amazing capacity. And it's like, yeah, I want that. I want as much of it as possible. And so I feel that pull to return to the Wichita Mountains to go on the vision quest. I had a friend who helped me, and he would actually come and check on me during my early 30s when I was first going to the vision quest. But ever since then, I've been on my own, spring and fall, just going back. So many times I've been up there on the third night, but especially on the fourth night, I'd feel those forces, those beings just descend into my body. And again, it'd be like a near-death experience. I'd be reliving past traumatic events or portions of my life. And I could see, I could feel how they had shaped me. And I would see how they precipitated these patterns that I was habitually reenacting in my relationships and other areas of my life, how they had stunted my development in various ways. And so these traumatic wounds that I've been carrying, this other emotional wounding that had so stunted my development in many ways, these wounds were healing. And all these years that I've been in practice, and as I work with these individuals, I can see, I could feel these wounds healing. And as I listen to these individuals and they describe to me the healing and the transformation they are undergoing in their bodies and their minds and their lives. But as I move about in the world, I encounter so many people and seeing all these individuals that carry these profoundly deep emotional wounds, the traumas that they carry, so much of that never heals. And I watch how they carry it for decades. Most people just end up carrying it to their grave. And so I am profoundly grateful to have the opportunity as I go through the vision quests. Every time I go, it keeps going to deeper levels, healing and transforming these parts of myself that have carried the trauma and other emotional wounding. These parts of me go through this transformation. I experience myself developing these greater capacities, greater resources, that I become far more capable. It's expanding my range of motion. And for me, that's very gratifying. Native people, again, as I mentioned, they say you go through the vision quest and these other forces or beings will come to you and they offer you these gifts, what they refer to as medicine. There's gifts of healing. And among the Native American tribes, these traditional doctors possessed very specific kinds of medicine or healing gifts. Some were known for treating, say, neurological disorders, others respiratory issues. There were some extraordinarily powerful doctors that were known for, say, if a person was wounded in battle, they would extract the projectile, the bullet or the arrow, and they could seal the wound. They had that level of power, that great of healing capacity. As I've gone through the vision quest repeatedly, there have been many instances where I would feel these forces or beings coming to me. Not only would it be, I would experience the healing of the traumas and other emotional wounding, all the stress, and we go through a lot over the course of our lives, and I could feel myself digesting all that. I could feel all this being transformed in a way that it became fuel for growth. Not only could I feel this healing taking place within me, but I could feel these beings or this presence coming to me, and I would receive other additional gifts of healing. And so afterwards, I'd come down from the mountain and I'd be working with different individuals. And I wouldn't tell them necessarily what I had experienced on the mountain. I'm not sure exactly where it came from, but there's this native quote that I heard years ago that says, "Power told is power lost." So you don't reveal specifically the medicine that you receive, but I would work with somebody and they would describe certain kinds of forces or beings, working with them during the session while they were laying on I use a massage table when I work with people, and they have them laying on the table, and they would describe these same forces or beings as like, wow, that's amazing. And I would just acknowledge, like, yeah, that's something I work with. And this happened on many occasions over the years, different people that I've worked with, people that never met before. And so to me, that's that confirmation or validation. And one of my favorite quotes that was attributed to Albert Einstein, I think it was something like, "The more I learn, the more I realize I have yet to know." I've always been inspired by the traditional Native American doctors, how they possess these various gifts, powers that they utilize to facilitate healing. There were many accounts among the Native Americans too, other kinds of powers. Some had the ability to bring the rain in times of drought. There was something referred to as war medicine. It's maybe it's a big drawback among some of these native tribes that they were quite warlike and they were often battling each other. And some of them had this power where they would go flying into the face of the battle. And there were accounts of some of them had these big war bonnets with all the eagle feathers. And all these feathers would be shot out of the war bonnet. And yet that individual who possessed the war medicine didn't have a scratch on his body. And that's just a small sampling of the kinds of gifts and powers that many of these individuals possess. And I've always been, even as an adolescent, growing up in Southeast Texas, and it just felt boring as shit. I just felt that there's got to be more to life than this. And just the life that so many people are living in, what I think of as our modern day world, devoid of any real substance or nutrients. But having this fascination, I've trained for years also with the master from China in the internal martial arts of Xing Quan, Baguazhang, Tai Chi, and Qigong. And I'd hear many accounts of individuals within these internal martial arts lineages that also possessed various gifts or paranormal abilities. And I've experienced some degree of that myself, just training with this master as well. Spending time in India and Sri Lanka, yogis, gurus, sadhus, spending time with these individuals and experiencing this profound power that some of them possess. And even being in Sri Lanka, there are these people referred to as Kapu Mahata that they'll go into these profound trance states, and they're wearing these masks. The Christian missionaries call them devil dancers. They're in this kind of trance or possessed state, and they're walking across beds of coal, or they'll take a sword that's extraordinarily sharp, and they'll have somebody holding the handle of the sword and in their hands, positioning the blade upwards, and the person on the other end of the sword holding the blade between their hands again, so the blade's positioned upwards. And these got individuals, and I've witnessed this. One of them would balanced himself on top of the blade of that sword. And so I see these individuals that possess these gifts and these powers. And that fascinates me. It's like, hey, there's so much more in terms of human potential that people in our modern day world, it's like they don't have a clue. They have no idea these things even exist. So for me to go on the vision quest, it's an opportunity to step into this realm to experience something far greater, far more powerful. And this is what the native elders would say, this is your most direct connection to the higher power. So every time I go, I feel myself deepening this connection to the higher power. I watch as children, teens, and young adults, there's all this life force in their bodies. I see and I feel the generative cycles that facilitate this growth and development, how they move through one developmental cycle after another. They're continually learning and growing and evolving. But as people get into their later 20s and on up into their 30s, 40s, 50s, and on, I see how people stagnate. So many people contract around the deeply wounding experiences. They stop growing, learning, evolving, and they stagnate. And that is my greatest fear, is the fear of stagnating. For me, it is critically important to be continually learning and growing and evolving. And so every time I go through the vision quest, I feel that much more alive. I'm digesting. So much of the trauma of my childhood and adolescence is healed, but we go through a ton of shit in our lives. And working in a culture where people are so resistant, so avoidant when it comes to, people are like, I don't want to feel, I don't want to deal with those emotions, I don't want to go there, pretend it doesn't exist. And the fact that people disconnect the way they do, don't face the issues, don't process their emotions, and they hold that in their bodies. And in doing so, it is contributing, it feeds into, we have our own individual shadow, our own individual destructive force. But individually, as each of us do that, as we deny, avoid, suppress, we don't go there, then we are also feeding the collective shadow, the collective destructive forces that are reflected in the gross ignorance that we see in our society and around the world. We talk about consciousness. In this case, we're talking about the lack thereof, the fact that so many people are so profoundly lacking in awareness. The fact that history repeats itself is due largely to the fact that people hold this profound wounding, all the pain and the trauma and everything that they, the emotions, everything that they suppress or avoid, they act out. And so the wounding perpetuates itself. It's that reenactment where it gets passed down generation after generation, and that destructive force individually, we're feeding the collective, the abuses of children, abuses of animals, war and other forms of violence. And so I feel we each have a responsibility, to the best of our ability, to face the issues head on, to learn to work constructively with our emotions, to heal our emotional wounding, as we heal and transform the traumas, the deeply wounded parts of ourselves, then it offsets the destructive forces that perpetuates so much of the suffering in the world. Again, the wars and other forms of violence, the gross ignorance that is manifesting individually in our society and globally, for that matter. And so every time I go through the vision quest, it's for me, as I said, an opportunity to heal my own emotional wounding and even all the day-to-day stresses that I face, as we all do. We're all dealing with all kinds of stressful, challenging situations living in this modern day world. Every time I go through the vision quest, I'm digesting, healing. That's being transformed in such a way it becomes fuel for growth. I become stronger, more resilient, more aware, more insightful, more resourceful, more capable. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity, despite the fact that I experienced this profound suffering or discomfort for the 4 days and nights. And it's not suffering the whole time. There are moments where it's actually enjoyable. There are moments of beauty, but for the time that I suffer, I get through it. And it's a very small price to pay for what I get in return. So I think I've said pretty much everything I wanted to share today. So I very much appreciate those of you who listen, who join me for this, what I have to share. Do be sure to look below, click like, subscribe, share this video with anyone you feel will benefit. And if I could be of assistance, I do work with people individually. I could work over the phone, but if you work with me in person, it's way more powerful. So do reach out to me. Thank you again. Bye for now.